Good day. A few days ago, I did a program for this channel in which I discussed how the United States, without most people noticing, is actually becoming increasingly dependent in energy terms or in energy policy terms on its geopolitical adversaries, China and Russia. The Chinese, because the United States has been trying to persuade the Chinese to release large amounts of oil from their reserves to help the United States lower energy prices and oil prices specifically. Russia, because it is becoming the swing oil and gas producer and is also becoming the major exporter of oil to the United States. And I should say that I thank the person who corrected me on in the thread to my previous video. He made the point that in fact Russia has overtaken Mexico as the biggest exporter of oil to the United States. So we have a situation where the United States is becoming increasingly dependent, not just in overall trade terms, but even in energy terms and in energy cost terms on its geopolitical adversaries. And now we've had a further twist to this story because a day after my video was published, we finally got the much delayed and postponed and anticipated announcement from the US government that the United States was releasing oil from its strategic reserves into the oil market in order to try to reduce prices. And we learned that 50 million barrels of oil would be released in that way. It turned out that when one did the figures, the actual amount of oil that is actually going to be released is not going to quite come to 50 million barrels a day, million barrels of oil. Certainly that amount is not being released all in one go. Most of it will be released over a fairly extensive period, and the United States is looking to replenish some of that oil which it is releasing. In other words, it's going to be taking back much of what it is giving over the course of the next few months. And the result of this announcement was that instead of oil prices falling, they actually rose. And I take this now from oilprice.com. As of 9:27 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, WTI crude prices were back above $77, having erased earlier losses and trading up by 1.3% at $77.5. Brent crude prices returned to the $80 mark and were approaching $81 as they had risen by 1.73% to $80.96. I should say that though oil prices continued to rise over the course of most of Tuesday, they have fallen back a little today, Wednesday, as I'm making this video, though the falls have been fairly small. The reason for these falls, in my opinion, have nothing to do with this release of oil from the US Strategic Reserve. They are a market response to the increasing pandemic-induced restrictions that are happening in Europe, which are making oil traders worry that demand for oil in Europe is going to fall over the course of this winter. And I think that is what has caused this slight dip in energy prices, which we have seen, oil prices rather, which we have seen. I say oil prices because natural gas prices are, as I make this video, actually rising for all sorts of other unconnected reasons. Anyway, why have we seen the market react so negatively to this US release of oil from its reserves, so that oil prices actually rose rather than fell? Well, part of the reason is provided by oilprice.com, and they made this point. They say that despite the seemingly big number, 50 million barrels, the US release actually equals around 2.5 days of US petroleum consumption, which was at 20.5 million barrels per day in the pre-pandemic 2019. And as I've said, in fact, the United States, the US government, is looking to replenish some of the amount that it's releasing over the course of the next few months, so that the actual release is much smaller. In fact, this is, when unpacked, a token move. And the reason it is a token move, the reason the United States government has not acted far more aggressively in releasing much larger quantities of oil on the market, is because its attempts to get other countries to release large quantities from their strategic reserves have failed. India is only releasing around $5 million barrels of oil, which is an insignificant amount. One doesn't yet know how much Japan and South Korea will release, or indeed how much China will release, but it seems to be on the same order of magnitude. In other words, these countries, these 4 countries that the United States has approached to get them to release oil from their reserves into the market, they have essentially refused. They're only prepared to release token amounts. And given that that was so, the United States government, unable to call off an announcement about a release of oil from its reserves, something which it had flagged up over many weeks and which it was unable to U-turn on, because that would have been an admission that the attempt to get a concerted release of oil from their reserves by these other countries had failed. But having in reality failed to get those countries to release oil from their reserves in any significant quantity, the United States has in effect limited its own release to a token amount, though it has packaged it to make it look like a release of 50 million barrels of oil, whereas in reality it is actually, over the course of the next year, going to be significantly less than that. So what this affair illustrates is the extent to which the administration has lost control of the oil price situation. It is unable to control energy costs in the way that it hoped that it could. And there's been some suggestions, there's some discussion that the United States might decide to try to control the oil price by prohibiting the export of oil from the United States. And we read from the oilprice.com that there's some support for this move in Congress, and that a Democratic congressman has apparently told Bloomberg that the economics of such a ban on oil exports by the United States would make sense. I am much more of the view of another person, an analyst, Kyle Issachar, who is the Senior Vice President of the American Council for Capital Formation, who has told The Hill, and whose words have been reported by oilprice.com, he considers that such a move to ban oil exports by the United States would also actually act over the long term to increase oil prices. And this is what Mr. Issachar has said. Limiting US crude to the domestic market means fewer potential buyers and less demand for that crude. That would likely be followed by a corresponding drop in US oil production. Since crude oil is traded globally, reduced US production, regardless of where it is ultimately refined into fuels, lowers the global crude supply. Less supply on global markets puts upward pressure on price, not downward. Therefore, banning crude exports is more likely to raise prices than to lower them. That, by the way, is a classic illustration of how a market works and how trying to put artificial restrictions on a market's operations can actually result in the diametrically opposite outcome to the one anticipated. Banning exports of oil by the United States is more likely to result in higher prices than lower ones, including higher prices for American consumers. Well, what does the United States do in this situation? Well, we've seen that this attempt to get other countries to increase oil production, the OPEC producers, and Russia, that has got nowhere. The Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, MBS, doesn't like President Biden very much, apparently. The two men don't get on, and he's not happy with the way in which President Biden basically accused him of complicity in the Khashoggi affair, and he doesn't like the positions that the United States has been taking with respect to the war in Yemen. So the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia is in no mood to help President Biden out of his political difficulties, and besides, he needs to replenish his coffers, but in order to make up for the heavy losses he experienced during the oil price war last year, when oil prices briefly fell into negative territory, so not much help or support from Saudi Arabia. And as for the Russians, it's difficult to understand why the Russians locked into a conflict with the United States, a geopolitical conflict with US bombers flying close within 20 kilometers of the Russian border and practicing nuclear missile strikes on Russia from those distances, why the Russians would want to help the administration either. And I think that all of this ultimately explains the reasons why the administration is gritting its teeth and has called off the idea of a conflict in Ukraine this winter, and why we are seeing steps being taken to set up another virtual summit between President Biden and President Putin. Because with oil prices probably likely to rise again in the spring, the US having failed to put downward pressure on prices by releasing oil from its reserves, given the refusal of other countries with large reserves to join the United States in doing that, the President of the United States is increasingly forced into discussions with his geopolitical rivals. We had that virtual summit meeting a few days ago between President Biden of the United States and President Xi of China, and it's now becoming increasingly clear that oil and energy prices were a major topic of the discussion that took place over the course of that summit meeting. And now we see the President of the United States turning to his major geopolitical adversary, President Putin of Russia, because on oil prices and on energy policy, Putin, to be very clear about it, holds the whip hand. Now, it's debatable actually to what extent the Russians can in fact increase oil production. Oil production in Russia is below its peak levels, and the Russians are locked into agreements with OPEC to keep oil production rate levels low. But conceivably, the Russians could, if they came to some kind of agreement with the United States, speak to the OPEC producers, speak to the Saudis, and try to agree with the Saudis and the other OPEC producers a general increase in oil production, which might put an upward cap on rising prices. And it could be that that is what the United States is working towards. The other thing that the United States may be working towards is trying to persuade the Russians to increase supplies of natural gas to Europe. Now, this has become an issue that's become tangled in a web of intrigue and mystery, because the Russians, Putin himself, repeatedly come up with statements about how Gazprom is going to start releasing more gas onto the European spot market once Russia's own reserves are filled. But Putin makes these statements. He appears to urge Gazprom to take those very steps, but that natural gas doesn't come. Since the Russians filled up their natural gas reserves in Russia itself, the flow of Russian gas onto the European spot market has continued at roughly the same levels that it did. That was the case last year, when there wasn't the need in Europe for natural gas to the extent that there is this year, because European reserves of natural gas were much greater. And one can't help but wonder whether this decision by the Russians, by Gazprom, to withhold natural gas in this way is partly because of concern on the part of Gazprom that simply sending more gas to Europe will lead to a further delay in the certification of Nord Stream 2, and that this is what this is all about. So at the moment, the Russians are not sending more gas onto the European spot market. They're continuing to fulfill all their long-term contracts for natural gas, but they're not providing enough gas to Europe for Europe to refill its reserves. Moreover, there's reports from the meteorologists, things which I can't confirm, that Europe is about to enter a further cold patch, which could cause fuel prices, gas prices, to increase even further as demand for gas grows. And on top of that, Gazprom has, over the last few days, threatened to turn off gas supply to Moldova. This is a former constituent republic of the Soviet Union, but one which has a pro-Western government, and which recently, and against European Union advice, negotiated a long-term gas contract with Russia, as it found itself in a position where it too was about to run out of gas. Part of that deal was that Moldova would clear its debts to Gazprom. It's got large amounts of accumulated debts to Gazprom because the pro-Western government, after it took power, stopped paying Gazprom for gas that was being supplied to Moldova. Gazprom insisted that in return for that long-term contract, Moldova needed to clear that debt. Moldova has failed to do so, and the result was that Gazprom gave a warning a day ago that it was preparing to switch off the gas supply to Moldova. The Moldovans have responded by saying that they are doing everything they possibly can to clear those debts, which they acknowledge. The fact of that story, however, is that it illustrates that Gazprom is prepared to take a tough line with Moldova and is presumably prepared to take a tough line with Europe also. Now, natural gas prices and oil prices work to a different rhythm. Once upon a time, long ago, that's to say about 10 years ago, when Gazprom did agreed long-term contracts with the Europeans for natural gas. Gazprom calculated the price formula for the gas it was supplying according to the movements in oil prices. But the Europeans didn't like that, and as we know, they no longer, to a great extent, rely on long-term contracts with Gazprom. They prefer to buy gas, or have preferred to buy gas, on the spot market. And doing so means that the link between natural gas prices and oil prices has been severed as a result of natural gas prices being decided now not in relation to the oil price, but by straightforward supply and demand. So you can have a situation such as the one we have this morning, where oil prices are falling, if only slightly, because of the appearance of pandemic restrictions, and natural gas prices in Europe are rising, as they also are, because, to be very clear, going into restrictions in Europe is not going to result in significant reduced natural gas consumption, because natural gas goes directly to people's homes to provide heating, and of course it also goes into the power system, the energy generation system, so that it can be converted into electricity and that way be used through the electricity grid. So natural gas prices are not affected by restrictions to anything like the extent that oil prices are. So you can have a situation where, because there's not enough gas and because there's an anticipation that the weather is going to get colder, that natural gas prices are rising even as oil prices are falling. Something that didn't happen, by the way, 10 or so years ago. So there is this problem with natural gas prices. Now, it's important to say that natural gas prices also movements in natural gas prices also affect the natural gas price situation in the United States, because, of course, natural gas is both supplied via pipelines and it's supplied also in liquefied form, and the prices of the two are correlated, and the United States is a producer of liquefied natural gas. So if gas prices are rising in Europe, they're likely to rise globally, they're likely to rise in the United States itself. And that, of course, is a problem also for the administration. So that probably explains why the administration is keen at this moment in time. One reason why they're keen to set up a summit meeting with Putin. It also probably explains something else. It probably is a major reason why the administration at this particular point in time is probably opposed to or hostile to some sort of a war in Ukraine. Because if there was a war in Ukraine, if Ukraine was defeated, because the Russian army marched into Ukraine and defeated a Ukrainian offensive against the Donbass, and especially if the Russians didn't stop at the boundaries of the two republics, the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics, were to press on, as many believe, all the way to Kharkov in the north and Odessa in the west. If that were to happen, the pressure in the United States and probably in Europe to impose massive across-the-board sanctions on Russia would probably become irresistible. But of course, if that were to happen, then there would be a serious risk that that would interfere with Russian supplies of oil and gas, not just to Europe, but in the terms of oil, to the rest of the world. Now, if we talk about Europe, let us assume that there was such a war. I don't expect it to happen, but let's just game plan it ahead a little. Let's assume that Russia gained control over Kharkiv and Ukraine's Black Sea coast. It's very difficult to imagine how in that kind of scenario natural gas would continue to go down Ukrainian pipelines from Russia, even if there were no Western sanctions imposed on Russia. And if, as one must assume, the Germans at that point refused or decided that they would not allow Nord Stream 2 to start piping gas, well, at that point, Russian gas flowing to Europe would presumably only go through Nord Stream 1 and the Yamal pipeline that passes through Belarus and Poland. Now, even if the Russians continue to send gas via the Yamal pipeline, and even if they continue to send gas via the Turk Stream pipeline to Europe, which they probably would, that would mean a massive reduction both in the total volumes of gas being provided by Russia to Europe, because the gas passing through Ukraine would stop doing so, and it would also mean, of course, that Germany and Europe would not be able to compensate for that gas through Nord Stream 2. And we would have a gas and energy price crisis in Europe, the like of which probably we've never seen. And at that point, worldwide gas prices would probably rocket. But there's another factor, because of course it's likely, I suspect, that even in that kind of cataclysmic situation of a war in Ukraine, the United States might be unwilling to impose sanctions to stop Russian oil exports. But there would almost certainly be demands in the United States, probably in Europe, for that to happen. And though, to be very clear, Russia doesn't only export oil to Europe or to the United States. Many of its exports, its increasing amount of its exports now, are to China. If there were talk of sanctions, Western sanctions on Russian oil exports, well, even if that talk never translated into action, it's difficult to imagine how oil prices again would not explode. So we would probably at that point be looking at $300-400 oil and natural gas prices in Europe, well, into several thousand per 1,000 cubic meters. So it's almost beyond imagination what that would do to the European economy and to the US economy, and most probably, by the way, to President Biden's prospects in the forthcoming midterms in the autumn. So one can understand, firstly, why at this particular moment, at this particular juncture, the President of the United States and his advisors might want to calm the situation in Ukraine down, even if only briefly, and why they might want to speak to the Russian president. They don't want a war which would create an energy crisis in Europe, a massive spiraling down in the world economy, and major political problems for the administration in the United States. They wouldn't want a debacle of another military defeat for Ukraine. I would add that if Ukraine were indeed to lose its Black Sea coast and its industrial city of Kharkiv, it's difficult to see how the Ukraine that would be left would be economically viable to any significant degree. It would be cut off from the sea. It would be dependent upon precarious land routes to Europe, and of course its pipeline, its gas pipeline, would have been closed down by the Russians. It's quite likely that that rump Ukraine, which would be left, would probably start to disintegrate on its own. So this would be a debacle, and of course it would be both a geostrategic debacle with Russia in control of the Black Sea coast and with Ukraine defeated, and it would be a energy and economic debacle also. So all of that dictates some sort of meeting with Putin at the moment and some sort of attempt to de-escalate the situation in Ukraine. And interestingly, we've now had a comment from the Ukrainian foreign minister categorically denying that Ukraine has any plan to launch a military offensive on the Donbass. Now, that is something that the Ukrainians have not been saying over the last few weeks. The foreign minister claims that claims that Ukraine was considering an offensive in the Donbass is Russian disinformation. But as I said, Ukraine has not taken any step to dispel Russian claims that it was considering that possibility until now, even though those Russian claims have been circulating for several weeks. I can't help but feel that this has happened to a certain extent because of American and European pressure. From an American and European point of view, the situation at the moment in the energy, the international energy situation, means that a war in Ukraine is, to put it mildly, deeply undesirable. So here we are. We see how, in the situation that exists now, the fact that the United States, the fact that Europe are becoming increasingly dependent in energy terms on the US's geopolitical adversaries is now starting to affect their geostrategic calculations. Whatever attractions there might have been for some people of neocon views in the United States to war in Ukraine, and such people undoubtedly do exist, all these rumors and talk of a Russian build-up on Ukraine's borders have undoubtedly originated in the United States, and they seem to be intended to create problems and perhaps lay the groundwork for some kind of a war. Despite all of that, ultimately, the United States, in the situation which it finds itself in at the moment, doesn't want a war in Ukraine, or at least the administration doesn't, because of the disastrous effects it would have on the world economy and on the general situation, the political situation within the United States itself. I've said this repeatedly, and I'm going to say it again. Ukraine, from a Western point of view, was a regime change operation too far. The United States and its European allies engineered a change of government, a violent change of government in Ukraine in February 2014. As a result, they wrecked their relations with Russia. They've compromised Europe's own energy security, and they found themselves committed to defending, or at least supporting, a political regime in Kiev whose policies they're barely able to control and which is ultimately undefendable. It is a huge mistake, and it is extraordinary that there is so much resistance in the West to understanding that fact. What the events of this winter and the events of this of last spring show is the weak hand the West has in this situation. If the events of the spring, the massive Russian counter build-up on Ukraine's border, when it did look briefly as if Ukraine was indeed intent on launching an offensive in the Donbass, what that showed is that in this part of the world, the Russians hold an overwhelming military advantage. What the events of this winter have shown is that the costs for the West of this policy of confrontation with Russia over Ukraine economically are becoming ever higher and are rapidly becoming unbearable. The time has come to bring this sorry saga over Ukraine to an end. The roadmap to do it is there. It is set out in the Minsk agreement. This altogether too clever plan, this cunning plan of Heiko Maas, the German foreign minister, as I suspect, probably enthusiastically supported by the equally incompetent Tony Blinken in the United States, to try to trick the Russians into direct negotiations with the Ukrainians, cutting away the two republics of the Donbass, sidelining their representatives. That has ended in complete failure. Far better to come to terms now with the Russians on the basis of the Minsk agreement and to spell out to the Ukrainians that that is what they must do and that is what must be done. Continuing with this policy of supporting Ukraine is both unsustainable and, as the events of this winter have shown, increasingly, in economic terms, counterproductive. Thank you for joining me for this program today. I look forward to you joining me in future programs on this channel. Please also remember to join us on our main channel, the Duran, where I do programs with my colleague and friend, Alex Christoforou. Please also remember to check out Alex's channel. You will find links under this video. Please also remember to check us out on our other platforms. First and foremost, Locals, where we are publishing an increasing amount of exclusive content, where we have an active community which also publishes its own content, and where I am increasingly doing live streams. You can find me doing live streams generally now every Wednesday at 1900 hours Eastern Standard Time. You will find me doing a live stream on Locals, and you can join me there. And of course, we're also present on other platforms, BitChute, Library, Rumble, which is of course now associated with Locals, and ODYSEE as well, ODYSEE and SuperU, the new free speech platform SuperU as well. And you can support us if you wish via Patreon and Subscribestar, and also by coming to our shop. You will see that I'm drinking from my magic mug with the US flag on it on this Americans week when it celebrates Thanksgiving. And you will also find lots of other magic mugs and t-shirts, long sleeved and short sleeved, and hats and hoodies and sweatshirts on our shop, so you can support us that way. And also, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button, and please also check your subscription to this channel. Thank you for joining me again today. I look forward to you joining me again soon, and have a wonderful day until then.